Hello everyone, hope you're well. I've been tying up a box of salmon flies in preparation for the upcoming season, similar to a box I gave away in a recent video. One of the flies I'm doing is this one, a tube fly called Shock and Awe. I had a couple of comments asking me how I tie this, and it occurred to me that there aren't very many recipes out there with explicit instructions. So I thought I'd make this video to provide some guidance, at least to the way I make them. Now I will say it's a bit of a pain in the arse to tie these, and you can buy nice ones commercially tied from various places online. If you search for Shock and Awe fly pattern, you'll find them. So if you're new to fly tying, I'd respectfully suggest that as an option. The fly was designed by Anil Srivastava, I think in the early 2000s. Until recently he ran a fly shop in Tacoma, which I heard great things about, but unfortunately never got to visit. I believe it's still there, but under a new name and different management. Back in 2012, he put a set of instructions on a local fly fishing blog, which had step-by-step illustrations, but unfortunately the link to those illustrations are broken, or at least they're not available to non-subscribers. There's also one tying video for the Shock and Awe on YouTube, which seems to be for a really big version. It has a thumbnail of a tuna, so I'm guessing that that's what they'd intended their fly for. The problem with that video is that it's got no narration or any kind of description, just music, and you can't actually see what several of the materials are. Nonetheless, it's quite useful to see how the guy puts his materials together, whatever they are. I didn't attempt to tie my own until I bought this Pacific Salmon fly fishing book by Johnson & Ferguson, a brilliant book. And they include a recipe for the Shock and Awe as tied by Srivastava himself in 2007. So with just a few little changes, that is the version that I'm tying, and which I'll now share with you. It should be pointed out though that this is a style of fly and not some kind of absolute written in stone thing. You could use a pretty much endless combination of materials, only limited by your imagination really, and create something that should catch fish. So in the vise I'm putting my HMH tube fly adapter, and you'll notice I've got the right angle hook of the pin to the back to your right. I've already cut a 1.5 inch piece of tubing and I've clamped it into the adapter. The tubing I'm using is this HMH small poly tube. The other bit of hardware you'll need is a cross-eyed cone from Hairline in the size medium. This is my last one, so if I screw up there'll be no video. And you can see I've already glued on the 3D eyes. I use a tiny bit of Zap-a-Gap to glue these on and leave them to cure for at least a couple of hours. The size of eyes that fit the medium cones is 3/16 of an inch, and I'm using the silver ones. Again, these are my last ones. I'm using white uni thread in 8/0, but you'd be fine using a stouter thread if you like. I'll attach the thread about 1/4 inch from the tip of the tube and make a very short thread base, and I'm not going to tie anything on outside of that base. Now the body of the fly consists of 3 different flashes, and the first one is Krystal Flash in pearl. Then I've got some Krinkle Mirror Flash in blue. And finally, some opalescent polar flash. Now to keep the thread wraps to a minimum, I'm going to tie all 3 of these in one single step. And to that end, I like to blend them together ahead of time like this. And of course, you can substitute whatever type of flash you like. So I've got a sparse clump, maybe 15 or so fibers total, and I'm going to tie those in right on top of the tube. Then I'll fold them back. Oh, come on now, behave. Now once they've been attached along the top, I'm going to trim them to length. And I'm just eyeballing here, but this is going to be between 2 3/4 and 3 inches. Now I'll invert the vise, and then I'm going to add the material for the belly. This is white Slinky Fiber, but you could use Minnow Belly or Deadly Dazzle, something like that. Again, this is going to be pretty sparse, and I want to make that just a little bit shorter than the flash. Now I'm going to fold this back, if I can, just fold it back to get an idea of the length I need. But instead of tying that down, I'm just going to let it stay at the front of the fly. Okay, I want it protruding like that. So turning back to the top of the tube, I'm now going to make the wing. And this is a blend of Slinky Fiber in dark purple, royal blue, chartreuse, and orange. And I've already taken the time to blend these together in approximately equal amounts. That is a messy and fairly tedious process, but you only need to do it once. So I've got a little bit of my mixture, and I'm going to make the length about equal to the flash. And then I'll transfer that so that it ends up sticking out at the front of the tube, and tie that down along the top. Now I don't want too much bulk in the wing, so I'm going to cut it off short at an angle. That way it'll fill in some space inside the cone, but it's not going to give me too much volume in the back. Now at this point, your only option is to whip finish by hand. If you try using a tool, I promise it'll only end in tears. If you've never learned to do this, there are some good YouTube videos and there are some really bad ones. So my advice to you is don't give up until you've watched a few of them. There, that's got it. And we can remove our thread. And these are very slippery materials, so I'm going to add just a tiny dab of super glue here, just for security. Now here I've got a thick papered drinking straw, and I've cut off just a little section to use as a kind of a collar to hold the belly and the wing materials out of the way. So I'll carefully fold all that stuff back and then slip on my little collar. Now I'm going to slide the rear part of the tube out of its clamp, like that, and then retighten it just on the pin. So now the tube can slide freely on the pin. Now this is quite awkward to do, but I'm going to attempt to push the cone back against the materials. And then I'm going to snip the tube so that I've just got about 1/8 of an inch remaining at the front. So while holding everything in place, you need to melt the tube so it mushrooms onto the cone. And then immediately use the pin to ensure that there's still an opening there. So at this point, you can slide off the fly. Now I can see I've got a little spur of plastic to get rid of. That's it. Now the cone isn't going to come off the tube, but it's still pretty much free to rotate. To fix it in place, you've got to partially backfill the cone, and I use either flow or thin UV resin. So just invert the fly and pour a few drops into the cone. You really don't need to fill it. You just need to introduce enough to solidify it in place so it's not going to spin. I've tried 5-minute epoxy for this and various types of super glue, but the UV resin is the only thing that works for me. So now that's cured, the next thing is just to add a piece of the hook holder tubing that comes with the poly tubes. Just slip that on in the back. And then finally add a hook. I like these Gamakatsu or Owner Octopus hooks in size 4. And that's just going to slip into the hook holder tube. And voila! So this should work for sea runs as well as for coho. Probably going to need to fish it on something like a size 8 because it's pretty heavy. So if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thank you very much for watching, and tight lines.